um, PowerPoint. Uzi, where are you? Uh, uh,
Do
Uzi,
you
you
see
were
me?
on. Um,
Do you see me?
I hear you now. Yeah. Okay. Can you share your PowerPoint?
1 second.
Okay. So while you share your PowerPoint, so I'd like to welcome Uzi Avner of the Dead Sea and our Research Center, and he will be giving us a talk on early bronze desert cults. Yeah, here we are. And Uzi, the floor is yours.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Excuse me for a second. I had a mistake here. Um, okay, um, here's our title. Early Bronze sites, cult sites in the desert during the early Bronze. And we'll begin with some preface. We see here the map of the Negev with the ratio of annual average precipitation, which is the blue, and the annual potential evaporation, which is the yellow. Here in Beersheba Valley, you see that the evaporation is 8.5 times more than the precipitation. But if you go to Elat region, you see that it is 180 times more than precipitation. What it means that first of all, vegetation is totally restricted to the wadi bed, which means much lower carrying capacity of the area. And also, water sources are very, very limited and small. So, if you imagine that in the past there were no supermarkets, people had to produce their food in the place. So, how did they do it? Uh, Indeed, there are some surprises about this. First of all, some views of the researchers who worked intensively in the desert. You see that the desert, the Araba Valley was no man's land, etc., by Ben Rothenberg. A brief lifespan concerning the habitation sites of the desert. Desert habitations were short-lived and a passing phenomenon. Desert people could not have existed without the support of a strong, stable political body and so forth. And if you jump to Moti Hayman here, the desert people were always hungry on the verge of death. Uh, as a result of this view, you can see here a compilation of the numbers of sites per period from the survey of the Negev Highlands, compiling 9 maps, which is altogether 900 square kilometers. And what you see here, first of all, in the early periods, almost no sites. And they're almost all very small, very ephemeral, described like, and so forth. When we reach the EB1, no people in the desert, no sites. And then an explosion in the early Bronze II as a result of the colonization of the desert by Arad. But then when Arad falls, in the early Bronze III, no people again in the desert. And then another explosion in the early Bronze IV, and then a whole millennium with no people in the desert. This picture was drawn, first of all, by Nelson Glick, followed by many others, with many explanations. How did it work? Ups and downs, small, short periods of settlements with long periods of gaps with no remains. This view is quite misleading. If you look at a very unupdated table of C14 dates, this table is 20 years old. Today, you should add to it at least 100 more dates. Each spot represent one or more C14 dates from excavation sites, mainly in the southern Negev, a few in the Negev highlands, and some in eastern Jordan, southern Jordan and eastern Sinai. But what you see here, this is a 6th millennium BC, 5th millennium BC, third, fourth millennium BC, and third, and where are the gaps? All of these represent many different types of activities, industrial, cultic, etc., and no gaps. There were people in the desert unless you prove that the animals lived all these remains and built houses and so forth. Um, Settlement in the southern Negev, in the Negev in general, with built houses began in the early Neolithic, which is the 8th and 7th millennium BC. This is the site of Nahal Isaron, excavated by Nigel and Avigofer. And you see here a complex of rooms with no courtyard actually, or very small courtyards like this. These are rooms, and this is a complex of one extended family of something between 30 and 60 people. There were many arrowheads, which means hunting. Animal bones were also wild animals. And some accident happened in this site. The excavators sent 35 samples of organic materials, mainly charcoal, but also other materials, for C14 dating. And what they got is almost 5,000 years of settlement in 1.5 meter sedimentation only. And where are the gaps? Actually, no gaps. It doesn't mean that people live there every night or even every year. There were certainly dry years or lean years, but in a settlemental scale and cultural scale, this is quite surprising to us. And the same result we got with much more modest budget from other sites of 4,000 years settlement and so forth. So forth. So our view of life in the desert and habitations in the desert should be changed quite drastically. Uh, Here is the survey area, survey map of Uvda Valley, eastern Uvda Valley, with some notes. First of all, this area was surveyed only briefly during the planning and construction of the air base. This area was surveyed later meticulously. This area, I hope to continue surveying this year if I get the budget. And also, this area was not surveyed, this area was not surveyed, but in this area of 60 square kilometers only, see what the numbers of the sites are. This is quite illegal. Today, no planning committee would approve such a density of settlement. And this is, to remind you, the driest area in the desert, in the Negev. So what is the reason for such a high density of settlement here? Agriculture, which I cannot show, we don't have time for this. But look at one thing, the black triangles are settlement sites, utilitarian sites. The red ones are cult sites. The area is very, very rich with cult sites, which is typical for the desert in general. Um, See what we know today, when only about a quarter of the Negev has been surveyed meticulously. We do know sites outside these 25% of the surveyed area, but if the Negev as a whole was surveyed meticulously, completely, then these numbers were much higher. Nevertheless, we have more than 450 sites of standing stones. I mean only shrines of standing stone, independent shrines. I do not count here a standing stone in open air sanctuaries, in tombs, and so forth. There are many more. We have 230 today open air sanctuaries. Others are waiting for documentations. And to date, 367 Rhodanian sites, which are cult installations of the early Neolithic and late Neolithic built on mountains. Only small areas were surveyed for these sites, and we have such a high number compared to about 15 habitation sites that we know in the entire Negev of the period of the early and the late Neolithic. So you see that there are many, many cult sites in the desert. The impression is that a small population of the desert actually built many more cult sites, although modest ones, many more than those of the fertile zones of the Near East. Um, I can show you only very, very few examples of the types of calcites, and we begin with standing stones. Here you see the two earliest ones, actually earliest in the desert and in the world. This one in Rosh Tzin, excavated by Tony Marks, is Natufian, dated around 1100 BC, calibrated. And this is a stone in Har Harif site, excavated by Nigel Goring Morris. Uh, a large stone set in a wall facing the entrance to the room. Also, this one is facing entrance to the entrance of the room. Uh, this stone, the one from Rosh Tzin, is shaped in a shape of cigar, or if you like, also phallus. This one is unshaped. What is the point is that after this one, almost all thousands of standing stones in the desert are unshaped, not because of lack of technical ability, but because of a principle, as we see in a minute. This stone in Har Harif is unshaped, and also you can see that from the beginning, we have some distinction between narrow stones and broad stones. This will follow us into the early Islamic period. First of all, what is standing stone? Very often they are described as a cultic object, but usually with no further explanation. Actually, we have a good collection of ancient sources, biblical and extra-biblical sources of all different periods, something like 30 different sources. Here you can see only a small sample. What we see here, actually, that the stone was perceived as containing inside it the spirit and the power of gods. In this respect, the standing stone is not different than statues of gods which are set in the temple, but they are very different actually because they are abstract with no shape. And this principle that we see from prehistory through the ages is very eloquently stated in the Bible, explaining the principle. And if you make from me an altar of stones, do not build it of hewn stones, for if you use your chisel upon it, you profane it. This means that a complete stone is sacred, and this is why, as you see in the other sources, biblical sources, that complete stones are required for building altars and also the temple itself in Jerusalem. So this is actually the idea. See, here we are very close to the basic idea of or perception of God in the Israelite religion with no shape. And this is also shared by the Nabatean religion until it was exposed more to Hellenistic traditions, and also to the Islam, where Allah has no shape. So all of these actually stem from the ideology or theology developed in the desert already in prehistory. A brief view, there are different types of pairs of standing stones if you look at their proportion and position in the group. So here we see narrow and broad. Here we see broad and narrow, two even broad ones, uneven broad ones, and so forth. In these three, the left stone, in our view, is the larger one, with the reason that we'll see later. Here are 4 out of 3 types of trios of stones. I will not explain them too much. Here, some types of groups of 5. These ones from Sinai are 2.10 meter high. Here we see some examples of groups of 7. and groups of 9. In almost all of them, the central stone is broad and larger than the others. This one is excavated in Wadi Sal, Sinai. This one is unexcavated near Har Tzuriyaz, southern Negev. Here you see a table also, very unupdated. It is based on only 210 sites in the desert. And you see the different types in this column and numbers and graphic representation. And what is important here, that each group is repeated several times, which means that no accident here. There is some purpose in grouping the stones and putting them in the same order again and again. To make it short, we see here groups of, first of all, individual ones, and then groups of 2, 3, 5, 7, and 9, and also many, which are separated group. But all these groups are the same numbers in which we find groups or organic groups of gods in ancient mythology, in dedication inscriptions, and also in art. So what we have here is a good parallel between grouping of the stones and grouping of the gods in the different pantheons in the mind of people. Okay, one example. Here we see an aerial photo of Site 9 in Uvda Valley, excavated by Ruth Amiran, Carmela Arnon, Ronit Ilan, and myself. We see here actually two layers. I will not explain too much. Two layers of the 4th and 3rd millennia BC, but below this we have layers of the 5th and 6th millennia BC, which we know only in small probes with no architecture. Anyway, on the side here, there is a cult place, which first looks that way, a broad stone about 1 meter wide, a little more than 1 meter, and a platform stones inside with a large flat stone embedded in it, cracked and discolored by fire. After excavation, it looked that way. The surface level was this, and this, the pinkish color, is a result of discoloration by fire. It means that a platform actually began in this level and was raised up from time to time. Here at the bottom, we found a house, a kind of very primitive altar, let's say, with a Sifutine date of very early 6th millennium BC. A higher one was early 3rd millennium BC. So and also among the stones of the platform, we found the clear pottery of the southern family of the early Bronze 4 pottery. So altogether, we have here 4,000 years of use of this standing stone. So we see here that the early bronze here is only a continuation of what was before that. What is interesting that here we found this trio of grinding stones, not in this position, but upside down and covered by fist-sized stones. It was concealed after the last use. In two other shrines in the same area with broad stones, we found trios of grinding stones. It means that this is part of the equipment of the shrine. And you can imagine, if you have enough, good enough imagination, that women came to this place, made a ceremony for the fertility of the soil, which is the feminine entity, making some baking and sacrificing it to the goddess which dwell in the broad stone. To make it short, narrow stones represented the gods, broad stones represented the goddesses. So this is not exactly fantasy because we have text in Akkadian, Hittite, and Egyptian describing ceremonies like these. And also in the Bible, we also did the same. See what Jeremiah says. The boys collect the wood, the fathers lit a fire, and the women knead the dough to make cakes for the Queen of Heaven. So You can imagine here, this stone representing the Queen of Heaven, and women are coming and making a dough to make cakes for the Queen of Heaven. Actually, it is Oznei Haman, if you like, because the Akkadian word is kamanu, kavanim, kamanu, which is a kind of Oznei Haman. Okay, some points about the standing stones. First of all, they are non-common, uniconic perception of gods, representing gods in no form, no shaping. The earliest known matzevot in the desert and also in the world are the world. Sorry, the earliest stones in the world are in the desert, 11 millennium BC. During the 6th to 3rd millennium BC, the matzevot greatly outnumbered those of the rest of the Near East. Actually, if you look at this, in the Negev, we have almost uh, uh, 100 times, or 10, sorry, 10 times more than the rest of the Near East. Besides this, that the Negev is less than 1% of the whole Near East. In the fertile zone, only from about 2000, matzevot became quite common. In all quantitative analyzed characteristics, like orientation, number of stoning groups, etc., the desert matzevot are far more consistent than those of the sown land. Worshipping of matzevot continued in the desert much longer than in the rest of the world. So what does it all mean? It means that the matzevot were cultural and cultic elements which originated in the desert and from there spread to the rest of the Near East. And what does this mean? That the humble people of the desert had the power to influence the richer ones in the fertile zones in the field of spiritual culture. We shall return to this point. Something about burial. Here we see an example for a few tumuli tombs in the Negev. There are probably over 1,000 in the Negev. Not all of them were recorded, but in the past, they were automatically dated as Middle Bronze 1, which is Early Bronze 4. However, Moti Hyman showed that there is too much connection, geographic connection, between clusters of tumuli tombs and early bronze habitations. So he pushed the date actually backward to the 3rd millennium BC. In tumuli tombs that I excavated in Sinai, I received the dates of the 5th millennium BC, so we go even further. But if you like, if you go back to Stekelis, he excavated 2 sites in Jordan with Chalcolithic and early bronze 1 tumuli tombs, Edeme and Al Safrat. But in Elat, I excavated the cemetery. Here you see it is restored, removed from the neighborhood was planned to be built and restored. This is only part of the cemetery with the 20 tumuli tombs and some cult installations. And this is dated by 10C14 dates from the mid-6th millennium BC to the second half of the 5th millennium BC. So here we push the tradition, which is very well known in the 3rd millennium BC, early bronze, in the Golan Heights, in the Negev, in Jordan, etc., etc. We push back the beginning of the tradition, the 6th millennium BC.
Uzi, you have 5 more minutes.
Wow. Okay. The Nomis is dated to the 5th and 4th millennium BC by C14. This is one of them, very nicely built, preserved with a roof, but containing also early bronze 1 pottery. Here you see a cliff near Shacharut, falling down to the Arba, and this is a tomb. Here there are other tombs, and what we found inside, this is a tomb, and these are the finds. This jar is very typical for Babedra cemetery, of the very beginning of the early Bronze One. Uh, Open air sanctuaries. There are many of them. They are very small, very simple, but bear a lot of interest. Here you see some types. I will skip it. And all of them are built adjacent to the ancient roads. And in the road junctions, we find clusters. This is one cluster, Jabal Hashem al Taref, about 40 kilometers west of Elat in Sinai, with 33 open air sanctuaries. We find in some of them basins, and also matzevot, single, pair, trio, many finds, usually nice stones, but also tools. In some of them, we find also PPNB blades, which are dated to the 8th and 7th millennia BC. So this is actually the beginning of the phenomenon of the open air sanctuaries. There are two dominant types among them. One is quite long, up to 31 meter long, with elongated cell on the back and a standing stone. This one is unexcavated in Jebel Hashim Tarif. If you excavate inside, you might find a vase-shaped installation in the center, or matzevot, as Ben Rothenberg found in Sinai and in the Uvda Valley, excavated by Ora Yogev. The other dominant type looks like this, with now a cell in the back, but in the middle, there is a circular installation. If it is well preserved, you find a standing stone inside. These two are found often in pairs, as you see here. This is the first type, this is the second type. And here you see a whole collection of them, 26 pairs in 6 different sites, all of them with the same pattern and the same orientation, more or less, besides these ones, which have a different orientation. This is how one pair looks like. And
Uzi, 2 more minutes. So,
okay, if you compare it to pairs of standing stones, it's the same order of size, left and right, and also it's similar to the pairs of deities and kings and nobles as depicted in art. Look at this one here. The wife of Menkaure is standing a little behind him. So this sanctuary is set a little back. So by the symbols, which are the elongated cell and the circle, we can identify them, suggest to identify them as a male sanctuary and a female sanctuary. And the setback has another level of symbolism. It places the circle aligned with the elongated cell. So we have here some game of symbols. Now, if you compare the desert pairs to those of the Chalcolithic and early bronze in the fertile lands, you see some similarities. First of all, they are divided to several groups. In this group, you can read the names. The small hole is perpendicular to the other. But in all of them, the small hole is smaller, like we see here. Here, in these three, they are aligned, the two holes are aligned, but also the smaller one is to the right side if you look from the front. But in the eyes of the gods that dwell in the sanctuaries, this is the right one, and this one stands to his left, like the pair that we saw before. In this group, the two holes are even in size, but there is no one, also in the desert, that the small sanctuary is placed on their right side. This one in always to their left. So we see some similarities here. In addition, look at this wall of the Arad temple. It is much thicker than this one. In Megiddo, the difference is only 40 centimeters. So altogether, I make it very short, we see here common ideas in the desert and the so on temples. I'm finishing. But the point is that the desert ones are earlier by several millennia than those of the Sown land. So also here we see the origin of the ideas in the desert and their move second into the fertile land. So I'll skip all this and some summary. The main point is that all what we have in the early Bronze site in the desert is actually nothing but continuation of millennia earlier. That's all.
Okay, Uzi, thank you very much. We'll have, if there are questions, please save them for the discussion at the end of the session. And